Good morning, my creative friends, and welcome to another blank page in my art journal. Good morning, I'm Dr. Minette Riordan. This is Painting in Your PJs live with Minette, and I am here to really just share my morning art activation process with all of you to talk about how I use art as a tool for personal growth and self discovery. So while this isn't always step by step instructions, you do get to see as I paint along and share my personal process and practice with you. And this morning, I'm going to be using watercolor over the top of gesso. And I've got some inexpensive watercolors and some nice Daniel Smith watercolors to play with. I want to play with maybe a little bit of abstract landscape design this morning. Good morning, Tori. And our bird today is because I'm working on some wordy birds and affirmations this week, is the beautiful red-winged blackbird. And the symbolically, this blackbird interestingly has a lot of positive omens as its symbol. And for me, it's a harbinger of spring, right? It's one of the first birds to return to the area where I live in the spring. And they are so abundant. They're one of the most abundant birds in North America. They're everywhere, but we also live around a lot of ponds and grasslands and cattails, which is their preferred habitat. They can also symbolize the concept of our own inner power. And so, my affirmation for today is here and now is where my power is. Here and now is where my power is. So, I'm thinking that I want to do a painting with this beautiful red winged blackbird on this page and maybe something decorative over here to put the affirmation on. That's kind of what I'm thinking in the moment. I'm thinking he's going to get fussy cut and collaged onto an abstract landscape. I have pre-gessoed these pages here with pre-gessoed. I have already put some good morning Yvonne, good morning Marion. I have already put some gesso on these pages. This is just mixed media paper. This is cardstock. And we're going to see what the watercolor is going to do over the top of this gesso, what kind of effect that we can create. And I'm just going to have some fun playing with watercolor and landscape and sort of that pondy feel. This was just lying on my desk and, thinking about this is kind of what my landscape looks like, right? There's a lot of ponds and a lot of scrubby trees and a lot of cattails in the background and the big mountains, foothills and mountains in the far distance, and it's kind of a nice habitat for him. And I even love this palette, so I want to recreate this a little bit in my journal this morning and put him on the page too. And I'm going to just start with some wet on wet here. So I'm going to get some water. I've got a nice big round watercolor brush. And I'm going to just put those mountains in. And I know you can't see the water, but I'm going to get a little bit of a mountainy shape going in my background. And I'm going to come in with some of this dark blue here. Even I can hardly see the water this morning. It's interesting. So normally these gorgeous watercolors do something very different on watercolor paper. They spread quite differently. So it's fascinating watching what they're doing on the gesso. They're sort of sticking in place and creating a really interesting effect. That was a little bit unexpected, but I really love it. And I'm just going to keep coming in and layering a few of these different colors in here. And I'm going to try to see, they don't blend in the same way they do on watercolor. I'm going to mute myself for just a second here. So it's just fascinating to notice the difference on watercolor paper, other paper. So this is a piece of traditional watercolor paper. And if I were to just so my brush is dirty. Now you can see that puddle. If I was to put that down on there and put that paint, right, it's going to spread a lot differently on the page. My colors are going to mix together and flow together. And you can see the difference in the looks of the two pages, right? This one didn't flow the same way. And these kind of experiments are always just fun for me to kind of see what they're going to do. And I'm just going to spread that out a little bit. It'll turn into something later, a Rorschach test maybe. But it's fun to experiment. Also, as it's drying, I'm seeing the texture underneath of the gesso, which is really interesting. So I'm going to come in. This is just an inexpensive watercolor set that has some really nice colors in it. And I'm just going to keep putting some of this color down on the page. And maybe we're going to have some little bit of green in the foreground down here. And it's just fascinating to me. It doesn't adhere to the paper in the same way that it does if I were working on watercolor paper. And it's actually a really cool effect. I think I want a little line of that blue, sorry, here in the middle. Everything's blooming and green and the trees are coming out and there's pine pollen, so allergies have been a little bit worse. And I can let this maybe run a little bit on the page. Okay, I could create pages and pages like this. This is like so fun for me to just see all these colors blooming and growing on the page. I love this sort of morning playtime where I get to just sort of play with color. I'm not really trying to create anything specific. It's sort of landscape light, right? Landscape light. Maybe I'm going to come in and fill this in a little bit here. And that green and yellow are mixing together just a little bit. And right now, everything is very green in my landscape. It's very lush and beautiful. The cattails aren't quite back yet, but you know they're clearly coming back. And so what I'm really appreciating is how much green there is because it doesn't last long. It's a very dry climate here, and so soon we will be back to our gorgeous sort of golden mustardy, you know, dried grass colors, almost similar to when I lived in California. And so I love this sort of loose abstract look of this and what it did over the gesso. What a different effect than the one that I painted on the watercolor paper, right? Which kind of stays still and it stays where the puddle of water was and it spreads out and mixes differently. They just do such different things. And again, I'm really loving all the places. Focus this more. You can really see the texture of the gesso under the page. The watercolor went okay over the tape on the edges there, but this all that texture in there with the watercolor is really interesting. Plus this red, this is a red fuchsite from Daniel Smith, and it has glitter in it, like it looks like it has little bits of mica in it. So it adds some shine to things. So I'm just going to continue to play a little bit here and maybe just add a little more of that depth into my landscape. Refocus that. There we go. So just loving how this is playing together. And we often think that watercolor or painting, good morning, Barbara. Good morning, Blanca, if I didn't say good morning, has to be really complicated, but I'm really loving this just very abstract play lately and just watching what the color does on the page. It's just like a big happy experiment. And I think I'm going to go ahead and continue that on this other page over here. One page I want to have the bird and one page I want to have the affirmation. But I'm really loving this and I'm curious what it's going to look like if maybe some of Connor's gorgeous sacred circle design, or that one's actually a sacred square design, are still visible on the page. So maybe I'll start with a little sky on this one. And I have my pages clipped together because they're all folding up. And what will happen if I don't put water down first, right? What might happen if I don't put water down first? So see if it makes any difference on how these colors kind of flow together. So just learning to just play and experiment with our materials should be fun. Practice can be fun. I was talking to one of my private coaching clients, and she's an amazing artist and art educator, has been teaching in person in a long time. She's up in Canada, and one of the things she teaches is a version of drawing on the right side of the brain, and talking about the thing that puts us into resistance that she sees with especially her adult students is being willing to fail and not have everything they create come out perfect right out of the gate, and how important it is to be in the place of just experimentation and intentionally sometimes making things that are not complete or things that aren't meant to look like anything. And so much of drawing on the right side of the brain, the practice in particular, is about learning to see, right? Is about learning to see, and how our eyes trick us, and that so much of becoming a better artist is retraining our brain. So I'm liking this where the landscape is kind of going all the way across, noticing that my blues sort of faded together there, which is kind of interesting. Not good or bad, just different. Almost out of that little bit of red fuchsite there. So I have just fallen in love with this palette. This was a palette I picked for a class that I taught a couple of weeks ago, and I fell in love with these colors, and it was just kind of by happenstance playing with the colors. And again, just letting this flow on the page, just do its thing. Interesting, I can't see, it's more opaque than I thought it would be. I can't see all the colors behind it. So let's just let all of this run on the page a little bit. And I might do a little bit of blotting here on this page. I want to get some of this nice dark green down here in my foreground. It's kind of fascinating just noticing what the watercolor does, how it reacts to the paper. What I learned about watercolor is that materials are everything, right? That really good quality paper, good quality paints, and even good quality brushes can have a big impact and make a big difference. All right, so I think maybe I want to push some of this back so you can use this is just a tissue, right? And look at the full texture that I'm getting there. I won't get as much over here because this is already mostly dry, but I've got some nice sparkles happening there, some color flowing. I think I want a little more color in those mountains up there. But one of the things that I love about our red-winged blackbird is he is raucous. Like actually the males and the females are so noisy, and they nest down inside the cattails and the reeds along the edges of our ponds and some, dried riverbeds. And he the male in particular is very, very loud, right? And when we go on a walk, it's just a chorus of these red-winged blackbirds. And they are loud during mating season, and for a couple of different reasons. They're either looking for a mate, and apparently they actually have little harems of birds, which they think might be because of the reduction in their breeding territory, so they tend to be in groups. They build their nest on the ground, but he is very protective of his territory. And so the way that he displays his wings and shows the red on his wings and the yellow has a lot to do with what he's trying to say. So they will scare off other birds. other males of their species, but also bigger birds, like if hawks are trying to come, get the eggs in their nests, right? So they're just fascinating to watch and to listen to because here they are, sometimes in the very top of a tree, often on the top of a fence post, or clinging to the top of a cattail. And they're just so loud in their efforts to get attention, right? So loud in their efforts to get attention or to warn people away. So I've got some of this beautiful copper. Good morning, Leslie. Um, and I'm thinking I want maybe a little more shine in here. Just maybe brighten up this little bit of area just a little bit. And maybe we'll even put a little bit of that copper down here and make it look like we've got some, let that dry a little bit and add some stems and make it look like we've got some nice clusters of cattails growing. I lost my water in my ponds a little bit, but that's okay. It's the nature of watercolor, right? It's just being willing to play, to experiment, to just see what happens. And it looks like I've got just a big, happy, abstract mess, and I'm kind of liking it. So I'm going to set this aside to dry for a minute. And what I wanted to do with this red-winged blackbird, I had a couple of different ideas, is I think I might trace him on this vellum and then paint him and collage him in. And I'm probably going to paint him with acrylics, or I might try painting him with a watercolor, and we could just see what the watercolor does on the vellum. I also, if that doesn't work, I have a piece of tracing paper to play with as well, which I can see him a lot better through the tracing paper, and he's even more transparent. All right, let's try the tracing paper. Maybe we'll try both, and we'll try the watercolor on both. So it feels like it's been just a fun week of experimenting with things. And I've got just this is a Stabilo Aquarelle pencil. It is slightly water soluble, so some of this is going to disappear a little bit. We're just going to get the shape of this guy. It's almost like a silhouette because of the way the photo's taken, so you can't see a whole lot of detail. And they're kind of amazing when you see them. Like I watched one on the top of a tree on my walk yesterday and watch him puff himself up and literally push these little epaulets out so they would show more to make himself, look more attractive. But this is a bird that knows his own power. So symbolically, he's a good omen, he's a sign of spring, but he's also all about owning his power. So they're very protective. They're very sort of outgoing and gregarious. This is a bird who knows itself really well, right? And does not feel limited. I would say he's a pretty cocky bird. So let's see. Their bodies are just fascinating, the way they're designed. So we're just going to give him a little, he doesn't have a lot of definition. And I think if I want the detail, I would probably have to paint him with acrylic on this, but I'm going to play with some watercolor on the tissue paper and just see what happens. I don't think I've ever painted on the tissue paper before with watercolor. I have with acrylic. All right. And I don't know how black our black will be, but let's see. Okay, that brush is not going to be pointy enough. Let's try a smaller brush. And I'm working wet on dry here with the watercolor. And I probably don't want it to be too wet. I don't want it to spread. I want to have a little bit of control. It's going on more opaque than I thought it would. And we'll see. So my sense is that when this dries, what will happen is the paper is going to wrinkle and crinkle a little bit. I can already see it crinkling a little bit, so it's going to have some interesting texture in it. And I'm not being too particular here about every single little line. We're just trying to get the shape of him down. And then once this is dry, I will collage him in. And when you see him flying like this with his big fantail, he actually has a similar shape to a red wing or a red-tailed hawk, which we also have a lot of here. So it's graying out quite a bit. Remember, watercolor as it dries tends to lighten in intensity and color. It's interesting. I feel like this is a tiny painting, and I'm used to painting much, much larger. And I think Mr. Red-winged Blackbird maybe needs to get honored on a bigger canvas at some point. There were a couple of times on walks very early in the spring where they were so loud I couldn't hear myself think. It was hilarious, especially probably the males and the females, but in their down in their nesting areas, and you can't see them, you can just hear them. All right, let me get that little line of yellow in there. Okay, that's going to mix with my black, which is kind of fun. Wasn't as dry as I thought it was, so let me hit this with the dryer real quick. Interesting. So everything's just interesting, right? And then I'm wondering when I go to adhere him, I can't put matte medium over the top of him. Might have to just glue stick him in because otherwise that matte medium would just dissolve the watercolor. So my yellow has disappeared here a little bit. It's funny, you can actually, looks like you can see it better on the screen than you can on the actual thing. But once it's completely dry, I would probably maybe come in with like a yellow posca marker and really get some of that bright yellow, or let it dry and maybe try this little bit yellow. So let me dry that red real quick. And my other page is taking a long time to dry. That's the other thing about the gesso that I'm noticing is the watercolor is sitting on the surface of the paper. It's not absorbing into the paper like it does with watercolors, so it's taking it longer to dry and also creating some interesting effects. And tracing shapes, again, is a great way to practice drawing, learn to see, learn muscle memory. There we go, that's better. So now we have our sweet little red-winged blackbird. We've just sort of captured his shape in watercolor. I could probably blacken him up just a little bit with a couple of more layers. If we can get that a little bit more. So one of the tricks to working with watercolor really is the water, right? It really is practicing with how much water do you need to add, what's too much, what's not enough. And the only way to do that is practice and being willing to let go of any need to have it be perfect, right? So this guy doesn't worry about judgment. He doesn't worry about what anybody's thinking about him. He just sits out there and sings his heart out, looking for a mate, protecting his territory. He is pretty darn cute, isn't he? Thanks, Tori. All right, so let's let him get really dry here for a second, and then we're going to see how we want to attach him. And let's come back to this. And I still got a few little puddles, and so I'm just going to pick up just a little bit of those puddles. My pages are definitely pretty wet, but you can see that fun, sparkly copper shining. I love a good shine. You can see where my cattails have run just a little bit, but that's okay. And I've also got my Derwent Inktense blocks here. So I've got a Derwent Inktense block, and so I'm going to use that to come right in over all of this wet and just add some stalks here to my cattails. I love cattails. Anyone else? I don't know what it is about them, but I love seeing them. They always just feel a little bit magical and mysterious. Good morning, Kay. And red-winged blackbirds are cute, right? They are cute, and they're beautiful in flight when you see them. They're amazing. But I love cattails. And so the cool thing about the Derwents is you can actually dip them in water and use them wet, and you get different effects and marks. You can also wet a brush, and especially with the sticks, and mix and match these things. So it looks like some of the gesso and the paint are still just a little bit wet under there, but that's okay. All right, so we have a nice little, very simple abstract landscape here. Make sure there's no gesso on this, because if you get gesso on these, they dry hard and it can be hard to get them off. So I'm going to hit this with my dryer. We're going to get it super, super dry. And then we're going to look at how to get our bird on there and how to get our affirmation on there as well. And that affirmation is here and now is where my is. Here and now is where my is. And I'm kind of liking the blue up there as well. So before I hit it with the dryer, come back, add that nice bright blue to the sky. Now that my blue is dry, so I should be able to come in and layer that in without it just totally running into my mountains. Not worrying too much about getting it perfectly aligned. It's interesting, I must not have gesso on the tape right there, and the watercolor is sort of pooling on the tape in some interesting ways. All right, that feels more complete. Again, these abstract landscapes make me happy. They're not perfect, they're not anything, they're just colorful and playful. So I don't know where the cats are this morning. They must be upstairs in their cat tree having a snooze after breakfast. But Diego was down here bugging me earlier, but I haven't seen him for a little while. So the birds have been active at the bird feeder, so they spend a lot of time in their cat tree looking out the window, and we call it kitty TV. So there's bunnies and big doves and beautiful little house finches. So this is going to take a minute to get this nice and dry. So it's interesting, the cardstock is drying a lot quicker. This mixed media paper is a lot more wet and is taking a long time for some of those puddles to dry. So noticing the difference in the substrates, right? How the paint reacts to one side or the other is another valuable plaything to do. All right, let's cut him out. And I'm almost thinking, because he's on this nice tissue paper, that he could just stay in there and maybe get tucked into the journal, but I would keep the flap open a little bit, right? That so that we can see him, but there's this landscape behind that's kind of interesting. Just cut off a little bit of this extra, but I'm not fussy cutting him. And I love am having fun working with transparency, seeing what I can do with it. Again, that was inspired by a class I watched from Autumn Moon Art. So it's kind of interesting just having him on here and me. All right. My silly OBS is my streaming software is disconnecting and reconnecting. All right. I like him kind of loose. And that makes me curious also about putting the affirmation here, that's still wet there, on this transparency as well and having it be able to see the words behind. So we'll think about that. And I'm going to see if I put just a little glue stick on the edge of him. Make sure I'm getting the glue stick on the right edge rather than gluing him down completely. So if I glue him down completely, I lose some of my landscape, but I kind of like him loose. Then he maybe looks a little bit like he's flying across the landscape, right? I love little anything, little flippy flappies in my journals as well. Okay, so happy with that. Pretty cute. Loving my little cattails down here. Feel like they need just a little bit more definition. So I'm just going to come in with my black Stabilo here. You could do this with a black permanent pen would be great over the top of the watercolor. But just make them stand out just a tiny bit more from the background, just giving them a little bit of dimension. These guys must have been, page must have been still really wet because they definitely look a little wild and puffy. And again, this is even with the watercolor, right? It's the adding layers, taking layers away, just looking at what is it that our eye is seeing or not seeing. Do we have enough contrast? And that's a lot of black, so I'm just going to pull a little bit of that down to some of these stems. and just give that foreground a little more definition than the background here. So one of the things I love about being a mixed media artist is learning to layer all the different materials and supplies together. And that just takes a lot of practice. I remember when I was first starting out, mostly with acrylics, because I wasn't brave enough to even try watercolor in the beginning, thanks to my friend Andrea Chebelou, who changed my mind about watercolor. But everything seemed to come out muddy, right? Like in the layers, I could never quite get it to work. And one of the things I learned was I wasn't patient enough. I was trying to work too fast and not let things dry in between. I didn't know quite enough about color, and I was having too much fun, excuse me, mixing all the different colors and having a grand old time making mud. So it took a while to learn all these things. So if your pages aren't turning out exactly like you want them to, then slow down a little bit, be patient, slow down on your layers. I'm almost wondering if I want a line of trees. Okay, I'm having fun with the watercolor, and part of me doesn't want to stop playing with the watercolor here. But maybe I want a line of just some little pine trees. Because when you look at the hills above my house, they're covered in gorgeous pine and fir and spruce. One of my favorites is a big ponderosa pine, which has a very reddish bark. My little hillsides look a little barren. So that looks better, just that, giving things a little bit of detail, letting them come down just the edge of that there. And again, it helps with perspective, right? So we have the mountains in the distance, we have a few trees in the closer foreground. Maybe this is a grove of aspen trees in here, but just having it have that little bit of dimension just made me happy. So I'm going to let those dry. I don't think I'm going to put any on the other side. And so now I want to decide what I want to do with my affirmation. And that idea that here and now is where my power is. Here and now is where my power is. And let's see, I have my nice permapaque, which is one of my favorite pens. I'm going to write it over here in the center so then I can cut it out whatever size I want, but I do want to be mindful of what the size of the page is, and I think, well, that one's a little bit smaller, but that would be close. So this will help me just sort of measure the size. And I'm almost thinking it would be fun to kind of frame it, maybe add some zentangle patterns, because why not? So if I use this as just a little bit of a messy frame here. Okay, the permapaque is interesting over the tissue paper. So another thing I'm just noticing, okay, that line is really messy. So I'm going to bring that one in just a little bit, and I can trim that off. All right, a little bit better. And I'm just going to play a little bit with some lettering using my own handwriting, nothing fancy. Learning to love our own handwriting is another sort of, I think, essential step on our mixed media path. I love that, Tori. Why not is the best reason. And so I would think about, where are the places in your creative practice that you find yourself in resistance or judgment, where that inner critic is really loud and it's saying, you can't do that, right? You can't do that. Because, man, that voice of that inner critic can be vicious, right? And so loud, and it can get us caught up in perfectionism, which is just a mask for fear. Fear of not getting it right, fear of being judged and criticized by others. So I got too much space between those two, but it is what it is. I'm going to go with it. And maybe we're going to just add a little, some extra little lines to this to zhuzh it up just a little bit. Nope, I don't like it. So guess what? I don't like it. I get to start all over. So we're just going to try that again. The my and the power are too far apart. So I could cut them apart and collage them on. That would be one solution to the problem. Or I can just go over here and try again, right? It's just paper. And so that'll get used for something else. It won't get wasted. But I'm going to try that again without the frame this time. Practice makes perfect, right? Practice makes perfect. And I have a different shape of paper, so it's not going to fit exactly the same way on here. Let's see. Can I get that now on there? I think I can. Lettering is one of those things I always say that I want to learn and get better at, but I haven't committed yet to taking the time to practice. I think it needs to get integrated into my evening drawing routine. Because I love beautiful lettering styles, but I also love my own handwriting, right? Like I'm very happy. I went to Catholic schools and was taught, handwriting skills were important back in the day. And so I'm not one of those people that doesn't like my own handwriting, but I'm always looking for how can I make it even more creative and more artful. And one of the things that I learned from an artist is when we're looking at handwriting skills, right, that we have to start to look at each stroke of a letter as we're drawing the letters, not writing the letters. And that was a really great distinction to make. Okay, so I want that W to kind of land about right there. So let's start in the middle of the word. Sometimes it's another trick for figuring out where you want things to go is to start in the middle. Then I just have to make sure I spell it right. I definitely wanted that power to be bigger than the others. All right, that's looking much better. The spacing feels a lot better. And I love this saying of here and now is where my power is. And why I love this affirmation is because so often we are overly focused on the past, or overly obsessing and worrying about our future. We're worrying about things that might happen, and we're caught in the land of, well, what if that goes wrong? That feeling of foreboding joy, as Brene Brown calls it. but the truth where all our power, our feeling of empowerment, our feeling of confidence, it comes from the present moment. And I saw a friend of mine posted something on Facebook last week that said, is the answer to everything just being present? And I think it's kind of true, right? That the more present we are right here and now in this moment, the more access we have to our intuition, our knowing, the more access we have to our breath, right? We're not holding our breath. Let me just straighten that out just a little bit. If I was being really fussy about this, I would use a ruler, or I would get my paper cutter and cut that out. But here we have here and now is where my power is. And I'm thinking I'm going to do the same thing that I did with my birdie. So I love this is tracing paper, right? So I love the transparency, that translucent effect. And I'm thinking that I'm just going to maybe glue down that top edge so it still flips up and we can see a little bit more of what's happening underneath. I kind of maybe want to see my mountains over the top of it there. I think I'm going to cut off a little bit of this extra at the bottom. And of course, there's still that one little spot of wet on there, but c'est la vie. Nobody's going to know it when this is all tapped down. So I'm thinking I want a little less paper. So we're seeing even more of the design. But again, that fun just sort of working with transparency and the effects that creates. So I'm going to get some glue stick along that top edge. This one I could 100% collage in with matte medium, right? That permapaque is permanent. And if I were to add matte medium to this and glue it down, it would, the paper would start to disappear into the design, right? So you can kind of see where I've glued this edge down, it's disappearing into the design. But I'm not sure if that's what I want or not, but I'm kind of liking it now that I'm seeing it. All right, let's go for it and see what happens. So let's get the matte medium out. Experiment and play is the answer, right? Experiment and play is the answer. What I don't know is what the matte medium is going to do to the watercolor, but we're about to find out. I might have should have stuck with the glue stick. So it definitely is smearing that watercolor underneath a little bit. So I'm going to be very careful not to get that watercolor on top of my design. Maybe these edges are just going to get some glue stick here. But what I love about the tracing paper, it's kind of like deli paper, and I'm just out of deli paper now. Deli paper would be another great option here. Is how the tracing paper just kind of disappears completely into the background once it's glued down, and once it's dry, it will be even more that way. It will wrinkle up, like you have to be careful putting it down. It does get bumps and textures in it, but I like bumps and textures. Got all that watercolor on my glue stick. All right, I think those are complete. So here and now is where my power is. It's so fun. I'm seeing the little hearts go up. I hadn't seen the reactions before, so thank you for sending hearts. So here and now is where my power is our affirmation of the day. Our bird is the red-winged blackbird who loves living in the cattails, and he knows where his power is. He's a super, super confident, very cheeky bird as well. So as always, thank you for joining me. Love the way that looks, the transparency. You can see some of the sparkle from that red fuchsite in the background, right? So we can still see some of that copper in there. So this is Dr. Minette. This is Painting in Your PJs Live with Minette. If you would click like on the button if you enjoyed this video, encourage other people to watch it as well. Thank you for joining me. And it's Thursday already. But I think I'll be here tomorrow too, because I'm having so much fun with this and I don't have a busy day, so I'm not usually here on a Friday, but I want to keep the wordy bird fun going at least one more day, and then I will decide what I'm going to do next. Thanks everybody for joining me live. Thanks for watching the replay. I will see you all soon. Bye-bye.